If you're interested in making a detailed platformer just like this one, within Gamemaker, using drag and drop, then keep watching.
G'day gamers, and welcome back to our drag and drop platformer series. In the last tutorial, I showed you how to add scoring to our game, which further enhanced the collectible items that we added in the previous tutorial. In this one, we're going to look at adding room transitions, which enable us to move from one room to another. We can also use this kind of technique to move through doorways, like this, and that just opens up your game where you can actually start to have indoor areas as well. So moving through like this. But let's have a look at how we're going to do this. So the first thing I want to do is go to our existing room. And we actually want to enable the player to leave the room. So let's adjust this. Let's turn on the collision layer. And let's move this rock down so the player can actually get past. So if I hold down P, I can select existing instances. I'm going to drag this down. And then if we go back to the mid layer, I can press S and that'll let us select something. And Control X to cut it out. And we can just move that down. So I've got a block here that needs an adjustment. And we'll just replace that one. So since we're looking at our collision layer, I'm just going to put an existing block over here to block the player. So Control C, Control V, and we'll just block the player from falling off the level on the left. Now, how we're going to do the room movement is we're going to have a transition object here. So the player will be able to collide with that transition object, and inside it, it will hold details of where to send the player and what room to send the player to. So let's create this transition block. Go up to Resources, right click on Sprites and say Create Sprite. And I'm going to call it S_trigger_transition. Now let's just edit. I'm going to just choose a pink color and I'm going to choose around about 100 for the alpha. Let's fill that in. And that's all we need for this. Close that down. Now we can go and create our object. Right click, create objects. And it's just O_trigger transition. Now the reason I write trigger first is when you have more than one trigger, it's just easy to find them if they're all listed by the name like that. Now the other thing we want to do is just untick the visible and select the sprite. We don't need visible because we don't want to see this in the room. So let's go place this in the room. So just over here, if I select the trigger transition, hold down Alt, it'll let me place it. And we just want that off the view. So the player actually has to walk out of the room to trigger it. But now we need another room for the player to move to. So with the existing one, I'm just going to rename it, press F2 and call it R_level1. And I'm going to duplicate this. So right click and duplicate. And the next one's just called level 2. Now we want to have the player be able to move to the same height as they were from the previous room. So I'm just going to modify this so that we are at the same height. Bring this one down. And just sort of clean it up so that we are at least walking into the same position as what we left. Now it's just some cleanup here to be done. Okay, now we'll just take this block and remove that. Now you can modify your level how you like. I'm just going to change this a little bit so that I know that I've walked into another room at least. And I'm just going to get rid of these things in the background here. And just that collision object there. At least we know now that the room is different when we walk into it. But as I say, you can change yours as you like. So let's just grab the transition object. I'm going to copy that, paste it over here because we need a transition to go back to the original room. Great, so that's pretty much the setup done. But we need to do some more setup for the player. So when a new room is loaded, everything in the old room is destroyed unless the object is set as persistent. Since our game object controls many facets of our game, we need that to be persistent. So that means once it's created, it'll exist in every room. Now our player also has variables that we would like to move on to the next room. At the moment, his HP is something we need to keep between rooms. But there could be more in the future. And if we were to create the player again at the start of each room, we would need a way to copy all of those variables across, as the old player would get destroyed. And we would create a new one with the max HP. So one way is to set up a dummy persistent object to do this copying. But what I prefer to do is just to make the player persistent, so now he will just be moved to the next room. But this can create problems. If we look at our first room, we are creating the game object and the player object in this room. This means if we move to another room and then come back to this one, the game and player objects will be created again. So we'll have two of them, which would be pretty much a mess. So with persistent objects, I prefer to have an initialization room run some code to create them. That way you can check if they have been created before creating them. So let's add another room. And this one will just be our initialization room. Now, instead of creating a new room, I actually want to make it a copy of these ones. And the reason being that the camera and viewport dimensions for the game are chosen from the first room. So we want to duplicate these in order to get those settings. So let's duplicate this one and we'll just call it r_inish. And I'm going to drag it to the top. Now when you drag it, you might notice that the icon changes to a little light above, a light on the right, and a light down the bottom. If you let go when it's a light on the right, it thinks you want to make a parent of this object. So you don't want to do that. You want to cancel that. You want to be sure that you drag it to the light at the top to get it up the top of the room list there. Now with this room, we actually don't need anything in here. So we definitely want to delete the player and we definitely want to delete the game object, but we can pretty much delete everything else. We just don't need anything here. I mean, it doesn't really matter if these things are here, but you don't want to be confused by wondering what they are even doing. So you can actually select everything here and just delete it. Select all the mid things, delete those, and the tile 4, and even the enemies. We just don't need anything. So what we do need is an initialization object to do the creating of the player and O_game. So let's go create that. I'm just going to call it O_inish. I'm going to drag that to the top, so that's on the top of everything else. I'm going to put the game up here as well. Now let's add a create event for this. And this is where we can create the player and the O_game object. Now what we want to look for is instance exists. We want to check to see if these things have been created already. So we go to O_game and we say if instance exists of O_game is not true, then we want to create it. So we're going to create O_game. Just going to put it as relative and find to put it on the instances layer. So let's just select those, copy and paste those, and we'll do the same for the player. And we'll just put this one on the player layer. Now, after they've been created, then we can move to the next room. Now, this object needs to be placed in the room. So let's go to the initialization room and we'll just place that just up here. I'm going to place it not exactly in the corner, but just up there. And I'll show you the reason for that in a moment. Now, the last thing we need to do is go to our rooms and actually take away the player and the O_game object. So select the player and delete, and hold down P and select this one as well and delete that. I'm going to do the same in room level 2. Hold down P, select, hold down P and select, and holding down P just enables you to choose things that are on different layers. So let's run this and see what happens. Now our game runs pretty much the same as before, except you'll notice that the player fell out of the sky here, and that's because we are creating the player at the position of here where the initialization object is. So that's not exactly where we want the player to be created. Instead, we're going to have some variables that move the player to his start location for each room, and also make sure he's facing the correct way. So in the create event for our game, let's create those. I'm going to make these some global variables. There are some set global and get global variables, but I'm just going to use the assign to do this because I like to type them out. It just helps me remember that these are actually global variables. The first one is going to be called player underscore start underscore X. And then we're going to have player underscore start underscore Y. Now we need a facing variable as well. So global dot player facing, which direction? So remember 1 will face to the right, -1 will face to the left. So I'll just set it to 1 initially. Now for the first level, we need to work out the position that you want the player to start at. So if we go back to our first room, we can look up here and see where do we want the player to start. We go to our player object, we can hold down Alt and place the player. If you zoom in, you'll notice that there's actually a small gap. I'm going to hold down Control and down arrow just to position them in the correct spot. Now the position is down here, it's 3265. So I'm going to delete that. We don't want to place it in the room. We're just doing it to make sure we get the right position. And we go back here and we'll set it at 32 and 65. Now we need the player to grab these global coordinates and position themselves in the right place every time they enter a room. So let's go to the player. And we're going to add a room start event. So this will run every time this instance enters a new room. So here what we can do is the player's X can be assigned the global.player start X variable. So whatever that is set, it'll be assigned to the player's X when the room starts. Now we can do the same thing with the Y. Assign that to the Y. And then we can also assign the facing variable to be global.player facing. So that'll position the player in the correct location at the start of each room. So let's test it out. Great, so we have our player instantly starting in the right location. But now we can set those global positions to new values when we collide with the transition trigger. And the great thing is each instance of the trigger object can have its own coordinates. So each one can be set to send us somewhere different. Now we can do that by utilizing the instance's creation code. So if we go back to our room and we look at our transition trigger, if I double click on it, it has a creation code. And this creation code is unique to this instance of the object. So this particular one has creation code. If I make another one, that has its own creation code. So let's go in there. Let's set up where we want to send the player in the next room. So we're going to have a variable here called target X. And this variable belongs to the trigger transition. And this is where we want to send the player. And then we'll have a target Y. And then we'll have a target facing. So these will be given to the global variables when the player collides with it. And then in the new room, the player will be set to those global positions. So in order to set these to something, we need to know where we want to set the player in the next room. So we're on level 1. When we go to level 2, here's where we need to work out where to send the player. So if we select the player, select them down there, and just push them down 1, the position is 32,225. So back here, we can change this to 32 and 225. Now our facing is just going to be 1 because we're facing to the right. Now the other thing we need to know is the target room to send them to. So we'll call that variable target room. And we're just going to send them to the next level, which is r_level 2. Now by doing it like this, we can also always have a target room and it'll enable us to go back and forth between rooms. So now we've set that up, we need a collision with this object. So back in here, we go to our trigger transition. Let's create a collision with the player. So when we collide with this instance, we need to update the global variables with this instance's own target variables, and then move us to the next room. So the player then will run its room start event, and it'll move itself to the correct position and orientation. So let's do that. We want to set the global dot player start X to be target X. And we want to set the global start Y to be target Y, and global dot player facing to be target facing. And lastly, we want to move to the room called target room. So there's one here that says go to room, and it's very specific. We want to go to target room. So let's test this out. Press play. And now if we go to the room, we can move to the next room, and that works great. Now, when we touch that transition object, our global variables are set to the transition variables, and we're moved to the next room, where our position is set to those global variables. Now, if we try to walk back, we'll get an error, as we need to set the creation code variables for the transition instance. This transition instance we just touched, it has no target X variable, so we get an error. Let's go to abort. Let's go to room 2, and this one here we need to set. So we need to go to the creation code, and we need to set it here. Let's go back to the other one and just grab this creation code, copy that, and just paste it here. Now we need to change where we want to send the player. So let's go back to this room, and we'll work out the position that the player needs to go to. So click on player, position them here, and just move them down 1 pixel, and we can see that it's 1248 and 193. Now I just noticed that ours is 193 there. I think I'm sending us to 225 on this one. I am, so let's make it 193, just so that we're in line with where we're going on the new one. So here it was 1248 and 193. So it must be that I've actually positioned this wrong. It should be just 1 up. Yeah, so let's just fix this. Let's move this up 1. Actually, we don't even need that one there now. We can just get rid of that and just have the single one. And then for our tiles, we'll just move these up. Okay, that's better. Now, just in here, I think I didn't change our target facing. We just need to set that to -1 and set our target room to 1. Okay, so that's a lot better. So let's test that out again. At least now we'll be aligned correctly when we walk to the new room. So we could turn off our collision layer, but it's fine for the moment. Oh, we've got 2 players there. So you'll notice the player on top of a player. So it's good that that happened, because that means in this room, I've left the player right here. So you want to make sure you always delete those. So let's turn that collision layer off, and we'll just press play. Test that out again. Great, so now we move correctly to the new room. Got a flying zombie there, so let's go and move him down. He really should be positioned on the floor there. And this room, we can turn off our collisions. So that works great, but there's a few things that we can do to fix that transition and make it nicer. We can have the player maybe pause when they enter the room. It'll make the transition less jarring. And you might have noticed that we get some dust happening when we start the game. You'll just see just here. And we also get it when we move to a new room. So let's have a look at fixing those two things. So first, to pause the player, let's create another variable called hasControl. And that will be whether or not the player is able to move. Let's just go here to our variable definitions and let's add a new variable. I'm going to call it hasControl. If this is set to true, it means the player has the ability to move. That's just a Boolean, and I'm not going to set it to true to start with. Now I'm also going to create an alarm 1. I'm just going to set it to 30. And we'll use the alarm to give the player their control back. So we just set it to a certain time, and when that time expires, the code in the alarm will run. So let's go and create that alarm. So this code will run when the alarm expires. So let's just set hasControl back to true. We can essentially set this alarm to a value, and at that time, the player will not have control. Now with our transition trigger collision, now in here, when we do a transition, we can set a few other variables. Now there's an apply to block here I'm going to use, and the apply to block enables us to apply code to another instance. And in this case, it's going to be to the other in the collision, and the other is the player. So let's set some variables on the player. I'm going to set the hasControl to be false. So we don't have control at the moment. We're going to set the player's alarm to be just, let's say 60, so 1 second. And also going to change the player's HSP and set it to 0, and the VSP and set it to 0. And that'll stop the player from any movement they may have already been doing. Now the last thing we can do is if we can ensure the code actually runs when we have control. So let's drag this up and let's say if hasControl is equal to true, then we want to run all of this. Now if I run this at the moment, we're going to get an error because this hasControl is a variable that belongs to the player, yet we're running this in the trigger transition. So we need to say other.hasControl to ensure that we're referring to the variable in the other instance that the collision is happening with. So now that we've set our hasControl, let's use it to stop the player moving when hasControl is set to false. So if we go to our scripts and go to our get input, this is where the player does their movement. So right here where we are collecting the player's input, let's put a check here and say that if hasControl is equal to true, then we want to allow all of this movement to be captured. Now while we're in here, I'm actually going to add another variable, and I'm going to add an up and set it to false. And this will just be if the player is pressing up on the keys. So let's take a copy of the space and we'll just change that to VK up. And we'll set up to be true. And we can use this for transitions into doorways, for example. So let's press play and test that out. So now you probably notice that you have a small pause when the game starts, and also we'll get one here when we walk through. So I can't actually move just for 1 second. And it's much nicer than just having them run because the player is still pressing right arrow or still moving a controller, for example. It's just a nicer way to do it. Now you also notice we get this dust forming when the player moves to the new area. And the reason that's happening is because for a split second we get put into the air state because our gravity is not enough at the start of the game to trigger us being on the ground. So there's a really simple fix for that, and it's just, we could just go into the create dust, and let's just only create dust if we have control. So if hasControl is equal to true, and that just gives time for the gravity to apply and the player to realize they're actually on the ground. So once again, let's test that out. Now when the game starts, you'll notice that we don't get that dust anymore. So that's great, that's just what we're looking for. And when we transition as well, we shouldn't also get that happening there either. Great, we just get a nice smooth transition. Now it's kind of quick, and you could improve that with things like a slow fade to black transition, but this tutorial has been long enough, so I'm not going to go into any of those details right now. Now you'll also notice that if we jump on an enemy's head, there's coins there, the enemy's dead. If we go to another room and then go back, those things are not persistent. And that's something that we might look at addressing in the future. So the great thing about this kind of transition is you can apply it anywhere. So in the middle here, we have a door the player moves through. So they move through in the middle of the level, but then moved over to the right-hand side. So here we have another door entry and the player faces a different direction. This is done with some particle effects, which we might look at in a later one. And the same with this light is just an asset with a few particle effects. It might be something I'll show in a later tutorial if enough people are interested. Now with the door entry, if you're interested in that, because the player walks on the trigger transition, it doesn't actually trigger unless they push up. So I've done that by having a new variable called auto transition and set it to true. So that means that this will be an automatic transition if that is always set to true. And I did that by just having an expression here that says if the other has control and auto transition or other up, then we go ahead and we do the transition. And by doing it that way, if we look at this level, for example, this door, if I double click it, go to the creation code, I just set the auto transition to false. So that means when it's set to false, you have to push up for the transition to work. Now with room transitions, I go to more detail in my Udemy course on making a tile-based platformer in Gamemaker. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a coupon code in the description, which gives you up to 90% off. My Patreons help make this channel happen. I appreciate their support, and you can see these superstars listed here. If you find the content useful, consider supporting, as this enables me to create more cool tutorials for you to learn from. Patreons gain access to all the source code, as well as any bonus tutorials, and all legendary Patreons get free access to my existing and future courses on Udemy. Udemy hosts my Gamemaker courses, which includes my latest platformer course. It's in GML, which is the next step up from drag and drop, and it can really help if you want to advance your Gamemaker skills. There's a special coupon code in the description where you can use it to get over 90% off the retail price. Lastly, don't forget to like and subscribe, as it helps me build the channel and create more cool content. That's all for now. I'll talk to you in the next one.